All right, let's dive into one of World War I's most infamous chapters, the Gallipoli Campaign. This is an incredible story of military failure, yes, but also of unbelievable bravery and consequences that honestly nobody saw coming, consequences that would change the world forever.
And that really gets us to the heart of the paradox here. You've got this campaign that was, by all measures, a complete and utter defeat for the Allies, humiliating. Yet somehow it becomes this revered foundational moment for modern Turkey, for Australia, and for New Zealand. So the big question is, how? How does a total disaster become the celebrated birthplace of a nation?
To really get a grip on Gallipoli, you've got to picture the world in late 1914. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas? Not so much. On the Western Front, millions of men were just stuck, bogged down in the mud and the absolute horror of trench warfare. It was a brutal, bloody stalemate, and the Allies desperately needed a way, anyway, to break the deadlock.
And the biggest problem, really, it all came down to geography. You see, Russia, a huge ally, was getting hammered, and they were running out of everything. But they were almost completely cut off. The German Navy had the Baltic Sea locked down tight. And then the Ottoman Empire joined the other side, the Central Powers, and slammed the door on the Dardanelles Strait. That was the only warm water sea route to Russia. So the Allies were in a real bind.
So along comes this incredibly daring plan, championed by a young, ambitious First Lord of the Admiralty in Britain, a guy you might have heard of, Winston Churchill. And on paper, it looked genius. The idea was simple. Send a fleet of older battleships, ships that weren't really needed to fight the main German fleet, and just punch right through the Dardanelles. You threaten the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, and you knock them out of the war in one swift, brilliant stroke. The stakes were huge, but man, the confidence was even bigger.
Well, the plan failed. And not just failed, it failed spectacularly. On March 18th, the Allied fleet sailed right into the strait and ran head-on into a line of mines that a little Ottoman mine layer called the Nusret had secretly laid just days before. The result was absolute chaos. The French battleship Bouvet just vanished, capsizing in 2 minutes. 2 British battleships went down, 3 more were crippled. And just like that, the Navy-only attack was over. A new plan was needed, and this one was going to be a whole lot bloodier.
So with the naval plan in absolute ruins, the Allies had to pivot. They doubled down. The only way to open that strait now was to land an army on the Gallipoli Peninsula and take the Ottoman forts from the land. So on April 25th, 1915, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers got ready for a massive invasion from the sea.
And things started going wrong from the very first moments. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZACs, they were supposed to land on this nice, wide, flat beach. Easy peasy. But instead, because of currents or mistake, they got dropped off 2 kilometers north in this tiny, tight little cove surrounded by a maze of insanely steep cliffs and ravines. They were trapped from the get-go, caught in a tactical nightmare.
And it was no better down at the southern tip of the peninsula, at a place that would become known as V Beach. British troops were just mowed down by machine guns as they tried to get off a ship called the SS River Clyde. I mean, of the first 200 men who ran out, only 21 even made it to the sand. The Allies had made a critical, fatal mistake. They had completely underestimated the Ottoman soldiers' will to defend their home.
So that swift breakthrough the Allies had dreamed of? Yeah, that never happened. Instead, at both ANZAC Cove and Cape Helles, the campaign sank into the one thing it was designed to avoid, a miserable, grinding stalemate that would last for 8 long, grueling months. This quote, this just says it all about the Ottoman defense. These are the words of a commander named Mustafa Kemal, the man who raced to meet the Anzacs on that first day. He knew they were outnumbered, so he gave his men this terrifying order, basically telling them to launch a suicidal charge to buy time. Every single man in his 57th Regiment was either killed or wounded. But they held the high ground. They held the line.
And the human cost of this deadlock was just, it's staggering. Over the course of the whole campaign, when you add it all up, killed, wounded, missing, sick, the total number of casualties for both sides climbed to around 500,000. 500,000 people on this tiny little sliver of land. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
But you know, even in the middle of all that slaughter, there were these strange, powerful moments of shared humanity. After one big Ottoman attack failed, the bodies of thousands of men were left rotting in no man's land, and the smell became unbearable for everyone. So they called a truce. For 9 hours, Turkish and Anzac soldiers put down their guns, they walked out, they buried their dead, friends and enemies, side by side.
They even shared some cigarettes and food. But moments like that were fleeting. Life in the trenches was a living hell. The summer heat was crippling, and swarms of flies, feeding on the unburied dead, spread disease like wildfire. Dysentery just ravaged both armies. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, winter came, and with it a freak blizzard that flooded trenches and caused men to literally freeze to death. It was misery on an epic scale. After one last failed offensive in August, the High Command back in London finally had to face the facts. Gallipoli was a lost cause. The decision was made to evacuate. And this leads to the most ironic and honestly the only truly successful part of the entire campaign. But think about it. How do you pull thousands of soldiers out of trenches when your enemy is so close you can hear them talking, sometimes just yards away? Any sign of retreat, any hint that you're leaving, and the whole thing could have turned into a bloodbath, way worse than the landings. What the Allies pulled off next was one of the greatest deceptions of the entire war. For weeks, they secretly thinned out their lines, moving men off the peninsula only at night. And they came up with these brilliant little tricks, like the famous drip rifle. They'd rig a rifle with 2 cans of water, one dripping into the other, tied to the trigger. When the bottom can got heavy enough, it would pull the trigger and fire the rifle. It kept up random shots, completely fooling the Ottomans into thinking the trenches were still full of soldiers. And the result? It was nothing short of a miracle. In December, when they evacuated the ANZAC and Suvla sectors, over 35,000 troops were pulled out without a single combat casualty. 0. The Great Escape was a stunning success, a perfectly planned withdrawal from a disastrously planned campaign. Now, the last Allied soldier left Gallipoli in January 1916. But the story was far from over. This campaign would cast a long, long shadow, and it would end up fundamentally reshaping the very nations that fought and died there. Just look at these numbers, the brutal math of the campaign. The Ottoman Empire suffered the most, with a staggering 250,000 casualties. But the losses for the British Empire, for France, for Australia, and for New Zealand, they were immense. A truly devastating price to pay for a campaign that accomplished absolutely none of its goals. And this brings us right back to that paradox we started with. For Britain and France, Gallipoli was an absolute catastrophe. Churchill got demoted. It became the textbook example of what not to do. But for the other side, the meaning was completely different. For Turkey, it was a heroic last stand that saved the nation and launched the career of its future founder, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And for Australia and New Zealand, 2 very young nations, fighting in a massive war for the first time, the courage their soldiers showed so far from home created this powerful new story. It wasn't about winning. It was about character, grit, and sacrifice in the face of impossible odds. It was their baptism of fire, something that made them distinct from the British Empire. And you could still see that legacy so clearly today in ANZAC Day. April 25th, the anniversary of those disastrous landings, is now the most important day of remembrance in both Australia and New Zealand. It's not remembered as a defeat, but as the moment their national identities were truly born. So we're left with this final, complicated thought. Can something be both a tragic, pointless waste of life and also the necessary fire that forges modern nations? The long, complicated shadow of Gallipoli seems to suggest that somehow, impossibly, the answer to that question is yes.